Hello, I'm Lance Finley, Executive Director of the Churches of God General Conference. We are so excited to bring this film to you as a part of the celebration of our Bicentennial. What you're about to see is not a full history of the Churches of God, but rather a look at the life and ministry of John Weinbrenner and his influence on the ministry of the Churches of God. It will be apparent that there were several values that were very important to Elder Weinbrenner. Values like education, new measures, preaching to the destitute, and several others. I think it's also clear that those same values form a thread that run throughout our history and are evident even today. As we stand on the brink of our third century as a movement, I believe it's these same values, which were so crucial in our beginning, are equally essential as we look to minister in the years ahead. So sit back and enjoy as we look at the impact and influence of one man that influences us even yet today. And it's our prayer that you would be inspired to take up these same values, to embrace them, and live them out in such a way that you're able to bring life and vitality and gospel-inspired renewal to your neighborhoods and to your communities. And as John Weinbrenner offered from his deathbed to his brothers and sisters, keep preaching Jesus and stay together.
Well, John Weinbrenner grew up on a farm family in Maryland, Walkersville, Maryland. He was born in 1797, and it was impressed upon Weinbrenner the need that he had to have a personal relationship with Christ. It was not just about knowing all the right answers to the catechetical questions or even having the best theology. As important as those things were, you needed to have an inward experience. You needed to have a heartfelt connection with Christ. Right before he finishes his training in Philadelphia, the Harrisburg Church here, they had a vacancy. They were looking for a new pastor. He had this real fervor, and so he's 23 years old at this time, a young man, very zealous, very idealistic in a lot of ways, and so he begins preaching pretty openly, and that would have been very characteristic in the Second Great Awakening. And there was something that was known at the time, they were called new measures. So these new measures were new in the sense that they were different, and for a lot of people, they were emotional. And the faith was in previous times through the catechism and recitations and dry sermons and whatever was kind of, how do you want to say, staid and straightforward. For better or for worse. I mean, whether he was the most tactful person sometimes or not. Anyway, his motivation at the core was that people would come to have a real experience of faith. So this led some of this controversies that were going on. And his board, there began to be a breakdown in communication between his elders who would lead the church, the senior members of the church, and himself. This banging of heads went on for a little while, and then ultimately it came to the place on one Sunday morning, whether it was miscommunication or deliberate, flip the coin. But that was like the last straw. This was already on the edge, and this is like the last straw to push it over when the door was locked and Weinbrenner said, well, they can lock the door of the church building, but they cannot lock the gate of heaven. So they marched from the church building and went down to the riverside, and he held that service on the banks of the Susquehanna River. And then the group of people who had assembled and whatever, and others who would have joined with him, formed their own independent congregation in Harrisburg by about 1825, and that's why we are celebrating the Bicentennial. Weinbrenner early on in the 1830s, that's around 1835, gets involved with the abolitionist movement as it becomes more prominent in this country. And here in central Pennsylvania, an abolitionist group was formed, and Weinbrenner, I believe, was the secretary of the Harrisburg Abolitionist Society here. And he attended the conventions in New York and other places like that. So he was very active in the abolitionist movement, and that became an important thing in the life of the Churches of God.
Well, I was born in Florida, in the Deep South. Where I lived growing up, it was called the black section of town. Another name given for it was across the tracks. When I grew up in the South, going to an all-black school, an example is that we didn't have a football field, but the white school would allow our school to play football on their field, but you had to walk across town. So while you was walking across town, there was name calling, there were things like that. I've experienced as a child being told, to ride on the back of the bus, or that this restroom is not for you, those kind of things. Well, even in the midst of where I grew up, I had a mother that was very wise, and she told me that, Victor, if you find the worst person in the world, you'll find good in them. And if you find the best person in the world and you're around them long enough, you'll find some bad in them. And I learned from her that I'm to see people as they are, and I'm to care for them regardless. I realized as I grew up that a lot of what people were doing was out of ignorance. Because many, there were ministers that were standing in the pulpit preaching, that were sanctioning such things. We believe that at Brownsville, as God's people, that we can live together, we can work together, we can worship together, and we can serve together, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of background, regardless of culture. So God led us on this journey of building a multi-ethnic church, not something that we of our own power did, but God just led us that way. Scripture teaches us that God created all people in his image. And I'll say that slow once. God created all people in his image. And I believe that that's something that churches all around the country needs to really grapple with and understand, because it means you love people that are unlike you. They don't look like you. They don't talk like you. They don't think like you. They don't act like you. In 2018, at Brownsville Church of God, we began a class entitled Multi-Ethnic Conversations for the sole purpose of bringing people from diverse backgrounds and ethnicities together for discussion. That's done on purpose because we want them to tell their stories. We want everyone to learn a story other than their own. What I always encourage people is to understand your story is not the only story. And you need to hear someone else's story, and you can understand then why they think the way they do, why if certain things are said, they feel the way they do. That's important. I know what segregation looks like. I grew up in it. I lived in it. And one of the sad parts is that on Sunday mornings, that's what we see in what's called the church. Most of the church period is a segregated period, and that's just not good. I think we have a fear of people sometimes that don't look like us or talk like us, and I say anything you want to get over, you have to challenge yourself to do it more frequently. So that's a challenge that we have. Go meet people that don't look like you. Have fun and laugh, because you'll find out that you're really not as different as you might think you are.
There was one thing that he did not want to see happen, but I believe he perceived was coming, and that was the Great Civil War. I think he felt that the change could come if people would change the laws, change their hearts, if there was true heartfelt change, that it would not take a civil war to bring it about. He was no John Brown. In fact, his son-in-law, that he fell out with James Calder over this particular issue, because Calder felt that no slave owner should be a member of the church. Because we had congregations in the South at the time, and Calder felt that they should be put out of the church. That was the strong view. And Weinbrenner's view was along the lines of, no, you should allow them to come and allow Christ to guide them to a better way. That if you don't allow them in, how will you ever minister to them? How will you ever reach them? And so Weinbrenner moderated. He got called wishy-washy by his son-in-law. I don't know if that's the actual phrase his son-in-law used, but I should say his former son-in-law, because by this time his daughter had died. But anyway, he and Calder fell out over this, but it does reveal Weinbrenner moderated some, and that was because of, I think, the fear of a coming civil war. Weinbrenner, from that very beginning, felt the importance of preaching the gospel to the destitute.
When I was born in February. The coldest time is one of the coldest time in Mexico, in my town. I wasn't born in a hospital. I was born in just a roof of awning, some walls of wood and cardboard, with a fire in the middle to keep it warm. The midwife, they had to bring her on a bicycle, 30 minutes on a bicycle, and sometimes donkeys or. I come from a very poor environment, and I know the feeling. I know the feeling. I had to start working when I was 9 years old. One of the things that really stuck on my heart, on my childhood, we had a Bible. I grew up in a place that the gospel doesn't have a room for them. There's no church in my town. So there were some people that came, some missionaries and some groups, but the people will kick them out. They will throw stone at them. So, but they will drop their literature, leave their literature here, boom, you know. My dad, he grabbed one of the Bibles, said, I'm gonna put this Bible in the bathroom, I'm gonna wipe my butt with it. So he put the Bible in the bathroom. So, but never did what he said he was gonna do. So, Bible being there, I'll go there and do my thing, and I read the Bible. You know, I got into it, and I'd be for like 20 minutes reading at the bathroom, you know, because my dad said he was gonna, you know, wipe his butt with it, but he never did, and here I go, and I just, I see it's funny, but it was the way I started reading the Bible.
So Weinbrenner was a non-denominationalist. He hated the fact that a building would be called church. And he made a big issue about that. Ecclesia means assembly, and that means the people. The people are the church, not the building, because he welcomed and communed with anybody who would embrace Christ.
I always looked at the opportunity to talk to someone about Jesus. I was coming from Mexico, and you know, I board my plane, and I sit next to he was 18. So I asked the kid, and I said, well, are you on vacation? I said, yeah, we came to Huatulco, and you know, me and my parents, and we live in Texas. And, oh, great. So you on vacation too? And I said, well, not necessarily. I just came to Huatulco. It's in Oaxaca. It's in Oaxaca. And we do, you know, mission work, and we had we opened a church there, and you know, we build churches as we can because they don't have a, you know, way. At least we put a roof and walls, and so that at least they can be out of the elements. So you know, I start telling him, you know, I show him some pictures of the stuff I do, you know, because I have my phone. And I said, this is what I did we did in Mexico. This is what we did in this other part of Mexico. But I was going mostly Mexico that time. So he was just listening, and then it was like 2-hour flight. Just, you know, before they gave the announcement that we're gonna land the next 15 minutes, he reached in his pocket and pulled a $100 bill. He said, "Here, I want to give you $100." And $100? No. I mean, he goes, "Yeah, I want to put the first $100 for your next trip." And I didn't want to take it, but I at the same time I took it because he did it with a sincere heart, and I felt his you know, the giving. I felt the love on it, and I said, "Oh, I'm gonna take it." So I came to church, and I prayed at that moment. You know, they were praying as I received it, and then I came here and I said, "God just blessed us with the $100," and you know, I told them the story. And then there was a 8-year-old little sister, she said, Pastor, I want to give my piggy bank for your next trip. And I'm thinking, when we're kids, piggy bank is the most valuable things that we have. But she's giving her piggy bank for the mission trips. And I said, okay. And then somebody else, I want to give. So that service, they donated about $1,500. In our church, we have, besides me, we have 2 people that does mission ministry. We bring goods. We bring clothing, food, because they give us, as a nonprofit, they give us food, and so we bring food. We bring, I don't know, maybe 6,000, 5,000 pounds of between clothing and food, and they donate bicycles, things, we just get them across little by little, because you cannot get them across all at once. So gotta take a couple of them, boom, and then we have a place in TJ, the other side of the border, that we put all these things. And then once we have a full load, then we cross the trailer and the truck, fill it up, or the van, and go south, 2 hours south. I got pulled over by the National Guard. I'm driving a van full with stuff. I took the seats out and that thing is full. And I get pulled over. And he said, he see the United States license plate on the van. He knows I'm coming from the United States. And he said, you have lots of clothes and food. And you're not supposed to, you know it's coming from the United States. And I didn't lie to the guy. I said, yeah, it does. It comes from the United States. And he said, well, that's illegal. You know that. And I said, yeah, I know. I know. I'm taking it to all these people that it's getting close to the winter, so we bring some jackets, we bring, shoes, and, we make bags of the, according to the age, from 6 to 8, bag, shoes, and then teenagers, So I said, yeah, yeah. And I'm bringing it to all these people. I pull on my phone, boom, boom, here, I bring it to these people. All these people, we put the tables and, and then we give it to accordingly. I said, and if you make big deal out of it, it will be the biggest sin that you're going to commit today. I told the officer. Well, just cover it. Just cover it so somebody sees it. I tinted the windows, but they said I tinted the windows, but if I put them too dark, then it would bring attention to it. So yeah, just put some cover with some blankets or something, so you don't get in trouble. Have a good day. The apostles did it. Jesus did it. Everybody did it, and I think it only takes is a heart full of love. If you have a heart full of love, you can overcome anything. 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 If you don't do it by love, if you just do that get excited about it. Yeah, I'm going to go to missions, and just because you're going to go to missions, you're probably going to fail. You're probably going to fail. But if you do that of love, you'll be fine.
It's a fact of history of our denomination that for long periods of time, for decades, there really was no global outreach. There was conversation about it, there was efforts being taken to raise funds, but we're looking into the late 1800s before actually the first missionary was sent. Clara Landis from Iowa was sent in 1896, really started the work in 1898, and it was the women's ministry of Iowa that really got behind her to promote her to go.
One of the things that I very much get excited about with the Church of God mission is that it came out of that missionary DNA and that missionary dynamic. It was John Latshaw whose relationships brought about our distinct work in India. And it was because he knew the Free Baptists who had been there and who were looking for people. So it was through those relationships when John Latshaw became president here at Findlay College, he got pulled into all of these conversations, and they were like, well, what do we do? What do we? And he had, he knew them. They were friends of his that were looking for people, and he said, well, that's easy. Well, we'll, have that conversation. We'll make sure it's a partnership, and then we'll go. What's beautiful about it is when we tapped into the Free Baptists, we weren't starting from scratch. We were stepping into a ministry that had a long legacy. So when we sent our first person, Clara Landis, in 1896, they had already been there over 100 years. Conferences responded to that. And you can look at the Women's Missionary Societies came about. They were eager and excited to have a cause like that, to be able to make a difference like that, where many groups might provoke increased resistance by how they operate there. We're already well established. They know us. We've been there for 125 years. And they know we care about their people. We attend to their poor. We're very generous. We have all of these schools. We hold these medical clinics. We hand out blankets and all of these things that we do because we care about the people. They know we care about them, and they look to us to provide, to train, to help, to give, and as a result, they protect us there, and they invite us in new ways to do even more than we have done in the past. And that's exciting to me, because that's, you can't buy a pedigree like that. You can't buy those opportunities. All the money and power and resources in the world can't open those doors, but there they are, open for us. And if you were to take India and you were to take Bangladesh as separate conferences, there are two biggest conferences in the Church of God, bigger than East Penn. And it's staggering to think of that kind of a legacy, that kind of a vibrancy on the other side of the world. We don't think of it that way, but Weinbrenner would be proud to think of how they cling to that gospel, how they sincerely pursue every day that calling in a personal and a holistic way. And it makes an impact.
Weinbrenner's heart starts with Christ, and then it's manifest in how he lives his life and what he stands for. And he believed that Christ could transform not only individual lives, but could transform society as well. And he invested his life in that. So Weinbrenner was involved in a lot of these movements, and the question is, I don't know how. They would have been very unpopular with some people, but with other people, there were others who wanted to see reform and change. But the question must have arisen about women in ministry at some point along the line. Well, in 1858, the West Pennsylvania eldership license, nobody was ordained at that point in time. The highest you could get was this annual license, was licensed for ministry. She was the first. But there were other women who were in ministry before her, but she's the first one that we know of who got an official license from one of our elderships at that point in time. So I think the Church of God early on recognized that God calls and blesses women for ministry and service to the Lord.
From the time I can remember, I have been brought up to believe that the most important thing in life is to know Jesus as your Lord and Savior. and to carry that message to others. They fed me that from the time I was born, and I believed it. There was an altar call once where my dad went forward to the altar. They were asking for people who would give their lives to working. And I went up, and I was 9 years old. I remember this. I went up and I kneeled with him at the altar. And of course, afterwards, everyone was like, "Oh, nice, 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 Kimmy," you know? But it was real. I was raised in the Church of God in Chambersburg. It was then the Chambersburg First Church of God. Now it is Grand Point Church of God. But my parents were both part of that church, and I grew up there and was very active there. Met my husband there, started dating as teenagers and got married there. We went to Haiti for 4 years with the Churches of God from 1986 to 1990. I was like in charge of the youth group at Haiti, and we went on retreat to this cabin in the mountains, a Boy Scout cabin, and a lot of our friends helped with youth also. And the kids were upstairs doing their thing, and we were the adults with another youth leader, and we were in the basement getting lunch ready and cooking. And we always would talk about, we were like, young 30-something, what are we going to do when we grow up? I turned to my friends, because we're talking about this, and well, if I was a man, I'd be a pastor. And I heard these words out of my mouth, and this seems weird, I know, but it was shocking. It was shocking, and it had come out of my own mouth. I had to actually turn away and get back to the stove, because it was such an emotional, it brought forth within me such an emotional response. Wow. It brings back a lot of emotions just talking about this, yeah. When we got back from Haiti, I felt this draw to more schooling. I hadn't ever been to college. I was in my early 30s. When we came back from Haiti, I was pregnant with our 5th child. So there was no money, there was no time to go to school or even think about seminary. But that's what I wanted. In where I grew up, the women did a lot of the work, but they couldn't sit on the administrative council. It was not thought they should be in the pulpit, that kind of thing. I only remember ever preaching at my home church once, and it was on Super Bowl evening. So that looking back, I was grateful for any opportunity they gave me. But when I think back to that, I get really, really angry. Because you can imagine how many people wanted to come to church on Super Bowl evening. Yeah. But I didn't. I was so naive at that point. I still was unsure about women in ministry, but God had opened this door for seminary, so I went. In my 3rd year of seminary, requirements of the Lutherans was that I needed 9 months to a year of internship somewhere. I had trouble finding one within the Church of God. But finally, Middletown, where I am now, their pastor, Pastor Bill Rice, at that time, was head of church vocations, and he knew I needed this. During my senior year at seminary, Pastor Bill Rice left and went to College First, and became pastor at College First. Interesting. And they needed a pastor, and I wasn't their first choice, I'm sure. I'm hard of hearing. I'm a woman. I have absolutely no experience pastoring. This is my first pastorate. But they hired me on and gave me a chance. And I will always appreciate that. I will forever be grateful that they gave me a chance. And there were people who were not happy that I was going down this road. I faced that. But the question eventually was, am I going to listen to what I believe is God? Or am I going to listen to what are these other voices that are saying, this isn't something a woman should do? We had an interim who suggested that maybe I should wear, he said, I think maybe you should wear a robe, an ecclesiastical robe, so that it wasn't so apparent that I was a woman. I look back on that and I thought, you're not going to hide the fact that I am a woman, even under an ecclesiastical robe, But and you have to know, you have to be sure of God's call. And I think that is true, not just probably as a woman, but as any pastor. Yeah. I graduated from Gordon Conwell with a DMin, Doctor of Ministry, in 2015. And I got a degree in revival and reform. And John Weinbrenner was both. He was a revivalist and a reformist. So I did my thesis on John Weinbrenner. Yes. And I did my thesis on Weinbrenner because I was concerned. This question has always concerned me within the churches of God. John Weinbrenner was a reformer. He was very definitely an abolitionist. He was into temperance, banning alcohol. He was into education. I think John Weinbrenner's main concern was that people come into relationship with Christ. He was a soul winner.
In a lot of ways, he is this really Renaissance kind of man when you think about his interest in music, the Bible, biblical languages, then his social activities and all that sort of thing that he promoted. So yes, education was very important to Weinbrenner, and he wanted everyone to have the best education that they possibly could have. Weinbrenner always thought that the center of the denomination, as he watched the westward movement, would ultimately be in Iowa. Well, it didn't exactly happen that way, but there were a number of people in Greater Findlay in the 1870s or whatever. It became a boom town, early 1880s, became a boom town because of the gas and oil discoveries there. Okay, and the community of Findlay, we already had a Church of God there. It was organized by George Harn in 1858. So we already had a congregation there, and Findlay became the home of the Hickernells, and he was one of our evangelists who went over into Indiana and planted a lot of churches and whatever. So Findlay, and it was a railhead, had become kind of like a launch point, for west and south and north and all that sort of thing. And when the community, when they discovered this oil and you had to boom there in town, somehow, and I don't know who connected them, but the church leaders and the leaders of the community got together and said, and we were looking for a place to establish a college, because we believed that we needed a place to educate our young people. So it matched up, and voila, what you have today.
When I came to the university, then Findlay College, one of my major passions or desires was to see the church relationship become more meaningful. Not to see Findlay, the university, or Findlay College become a absolute religious entity, but so that the church would be more meaningful on campus. By that I mean, when I was a student here, we were lucky if we had 35 persons in chapel on a Thursday afternoon or at noon, and 3/4 of those people would be faculty or staff. So the students really didn't have any investment into that relationship, to the religious relationship at all. in the background of being related to the Churches of God, the university was dominated on the board of trustees by Churches of God members. Therefore, the decision-making and decisions relative to the culture on campus in the most legalistic manners were going to be dominated predominantly by the church. But at the same time, as the church was trying to be legalistic and control and influence its university, it was losing the opportunity to really have an impact on campus. At that same time, remember, there were 35 people in chapel. Today, there are hundreds, 200 plus students on a Thursday evening worshiping. Students. There are numerous tens upon tens of Bible studies originating from the students, being attended by students, valued by students. That would never and did not happen when I was a student here. The church's involvement from a legalistic perspective has waned. It was no longer a legalistic domination process. But then the church got serious, and the university in that relationship, and said, what does it really mean to be related to the church? It's when you saw Christian ministries turn the corner and the influence of the church really became the influence of Christianity on campus. With the collaboration of the administration, started to build what I believe is a very powerful influence on campus that far exceeds the influence that the church once had with a dominant legal top-down authority piece. What's happening here at the university now is a wonderful way of training persons to be authentic Christians in the real world, okay? To train a student at a Christian institution, which in many ways is a good place and serves some students very well. But to have a university that is influenced ethically, morally, and in character development by the Christian faith, the church, and yet provides them a living laboratory to work in and to work out their faith in the process of becoming a well-trained, educated Christian who is going to be doing all of the various vocations that we train people for. That, in my opinion, is extremely valuable. But I do know when Christianity the rules about Christianity are calcified or are standardized within some legalistic definition, you start to lose the benefit of Christianity. John Weinbrenner saw that. John Weinbrenner saw that one very beautiful example of that. John Weinbrenner wanted women to be pastors as well as men, okay? Knocks the socks off of some people still today, okay? Some people in our society just can't handle that yet. But that is a good example of Weinbrenner's ability to think about the abstractness of Christianity, of applying it, the love and the values of Christianity to society in the means of what society could handle at that time.
Why aren't we troubling our city? You know, I really believe that. And so that's our move of what it looks like, is that we should actually literally cause spiritual havoc in our communities, you know? And so Weinbrenner, man, he really encouraged me. And he's my type of guy.
Yeah.
Anybody that gets locked out of his own church Padlock. I'm like, yeah, that's my dude. He's radical. Like, you know, I can embrace that guy, you know? And so that's what it's about, you know? And when you're doing right, you know, over there in the book of Acts, you know, they were upset with Paul and them because they were troubling their city. And I'll never forget the question was asked to me 6 months from us planning, right? 6 months in. And two gentlemen in church planning asked me this question. If your church closed down today, doors locked, it's over, it's a wrap, would the community miss you? That was a game changer for me. Because I knew at 6 months in, no, they wouldn't miss us. But that gave me a radical push and insight. Boy, you need to know your community. You know, and one of the sad things today is we can have churches and buildings in communities and don't even know the community. And the community don't even know you. And one thing I've learned is like, the message don't change, but our methods must change. Like the youth, you know, like, you know, when I got kids that actually, you know, come in with their pants hanging, sagging, now their pants are up. Okay? It's because I love them right where they are. See, a lot of times I think what we like to do is we like to clean fish before we catch them. And I'm a fisherman. Okay, that's my getaway from everything. I love the fish. But that's what the church do. We want to clean them and we ain't even caught them. They don't even know who you are. So we need to know people. We need to get to know who they are. Love on them right where they are, and then they begin to know that you care about me. You really do care about me, you know? Yes. And that's where I think we're seeing our move happen is because we're going in and we're loving people right where they are. But I believe if we can show and tell the stories, let people see what God is doing other than just on Sunday morning or inside of a building, I think then it'll give people enlightenment to say, or maybe I can go do a fresh expression like where people are meeting in the gyms and having church, you know, and so I just think that, you know, if we give people the opportunity to see Christ differently, there are fresh expressions of what Christ is doing now. You know, we actually go inside the high schools and we mentor kids doing school. You know what I'm saying? And so we're representing the kingdom in our schools. You know, so it's little things like that we're seeing like God is like, you know, he's interested in doing himself, you know, in spaces where a lot of times we feel like you can't do that. One of our locations inside the federal prison, where literally us going in and doing what we're doing has impacted the officials to the point that we have a federal official that's now part of our leadership team. She's now seeing them out here, husbands holding their families down, in ministry, working, having a job. And they would never normally see these things. They're seeing that. And now she's like, I want to be a part of this. I want to be a part of this move of God. And so we're seeing things like that. We need to embrace change. I see the churches of God now evolving to a place that they're getting back to what they were founded on, you know, and what Weinbrenner stood for.
I think as we come into this time, it's much more, I've heard the term cosmopolitan used, right? So we are a global society. Transportation is the most accessible it's ever been. Communication's the most accessible it's ever been. And so our ability to cross the threshold into other cultures, ethnicities, and for there to be really a merger of those things is extremely commonplace. And so church planting today, fresh expressions today, mobilization today is going to look different and does look different than it did even 20, 30 years ago. In the same way, a lot of the churches that were started early on in the denomination were much smaller. The formation of a church in our earliest days would have been 15, 20, 25 people to begin with. And I have the sense that that's going to be our current reality and the future as well, that it's not always going to be about gathering hundreds or thousands, though that'll still, I think, occur, but that smaller expressions of church will actually be bound closer together and have a greater ability to impact a neighborhood, a community, and probably church planting is going to look a lot like that in the next decade or two. Some will start off with a few hundred people and grow large, but many will start very small, stay small, and just keep multiplying out and starting new groups as time goes on.
If you want to understand Weinbrenner, you have to understand that passion for Jesus, and you have to understand that desire to see revival sweep the land and to see people come into that personal walk with Christ. Okay, that's, so to speak, on the one hand. But on the other hand, you have to realize this was not just about an experience, it's about a life change. And if you come into that experience with Christ, then your life has to change. Life change is a very important part of that. And then part of that life change is what I'll call is social change. And that is that he was a revivalist, but he was a reformer as well. So that it becomes very critical that for the cause of Christ, you address the ills of society to seek about reforming them in the name of Christ, helping people to have a better life. When he died in 1860, he died with two concerns on his mind. At his deathbed is recorded, I think it's Axe Shoemaker that recorded what he said. He talked about, oh, the glories of preaching Jesus. He said, I didn't realize it in the days of my youth, but in these latter years, I've realized how important, the preaching of Jesus. He told Shoemaker, he said, tell the brethren to preach Jesus and to stick together. Call it a winnowing, if you will, I don't know. But I think the spiritual need is much more evident now than it was before, when we were in what I'll call a much more cultural Christianity setting. Now I think there is a call for this more relational Christian connection. People are looking for genuineness, I believe. They're looking for authenticity. They're looking for what is real. I think that's what they were doing in Weinbrenner's time. I think they had plenty of the old catechism. They had a lot of what I'll call theologically the right answers, but there just seemed to be no life. And where did it impact me? Whereas I think that then, here we are now, I think it's a very similar situation. And so I think that the Church of God and all other churches have a great opportunity, to share the love of Jesus with the community through service, through making a difference, hands-on ministry, missional activities, any number of ways that churches can, so to speak, bless their community. But we are here to be a blessing. It's like being salt and light, like Jesus said. But it's a bit more than that. We want to bless the community, but to what end? So that they may know Jesus. And I think that's what people will respond to. The community doesn't need the church. It needs Jesus, or it needs the church to share Jesus, or introduce Jesus, or to be the vehicle whereby Jesus can be made known. And he then will change individuals, and he can change the culture. In his day, there was an institutional church, okay? Came out of the Reformation, a lot of dogmatism, but what they were doing was breaking the paradigms and delivering the message in new ways, in new measures, and doing so with new music, doing so with a new energy. How is that different from now? What's needed, at least as I look at it, I see that that's what's needed now.